The Vereen Memorial Historical Gardens today, it's got so many things to offer. You know, in addition to being a historical plantation, it goes back to the roots in the 1700s, and it has the old broad road that George Washington and others crossed through. There's also nature trails that run all through there, and these are great trails, and it shows you what this area along the coastline would have looked like, you know, prior to development.
Ben Burrows, director of the Horry County Archives Center at Coastal Carolina University, has traced the arrival of Jacques Vereen and his wife Suzanne Horry Vereen to Charleston, South Carolina in the late 1600s.
Jacques Vereen, or Varin, it's spelled V-A-R-I-N in those early records, but it must have sounded like Vereen. His descendants eventually moved up into the Horry County, what is now the Horry County area, which at the time, in the 1700s, was the Georgetown district and really comprised the northeast corner of the state of South Carolina. And after a couple of generations, we had a Jeremiah Sr., Jeremiah Vereen Sr., who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And he's interesting because he actually was host to President George Washington when Washington did his tour of the southern states. That Jeremiah lived on a Long Bay plantation, which was right at Singleton Swash, just above present-day Myrtle Beach. George Washington kept a great diary during his southern tour of the states. And we have his actual handwriting in his own diary where he talks about coming through this area. And it's wonderful, especially if you are familiar with our local old names and families. You can follow very easily where he's going and who he's talking about. And he talks about coming down from North Carolina and crossing the state line, coming right through the Vereen Memorial Gardens, on down to eventually where he stops and he has to make a decision. He can divert over to the beach and travel down along that hard-packed beach at low tide, basically right through what is now Myrtle Beach. And at that fork where you have to decide that is where the Vereen plantation was. They would make arrangements to stay at the Vereen plantation and wait for the tide to be low, and then Mr. Vereen would take them down to the beach road and guide them across the swash, which is now called Singleton Swash. And that's exactly what Mr. Vereen did with President Washington. And in Washington's diary, he writes all this down, and he explains that he had tried to pay Mr. Vereen for room and board, but Mr. Vereen would not allow him to make compensation. And he described Mr. Vereen as a very kind gentleman. His son, Jeremiah Jr., in 1797, Jeremiah Vereen Jr. acquired 400 acres of land, which became Big Landing Plantation. And part of that land is what later ended up as the Vereen Memorial Historical Gardens. Now, it came down that Vereen family line from Jeremiah Vereen Jr. down to a Hartford Vereen in the early 1900s, and then it went from Hartford Vereen to his son, Jackson H. Vereen. And it was Jackson Vereen, or Jack Vereen, that actually deeded part of the acreage of Big Landing Plantation to Horry County for the formation of the Vereen Memorial Historical Gardens.
In 1971, Jackson H. Vereen deeded 115 acres of land to the Horry County Historic Preservation Commission for $5. But before he did that, he made sure the Vereen family cemetery on the property was taken care of. In 1957, descendants of Jacques and Suzanne Vereen from all over the country joined together at the gardens for the unveiling of the Vereen Family Memorial. The family cemetery on the property was improved and expanded to include 8 new markers for Confederate and Revolutionary War veterans, whose graves were destroyed when the Intracoastal Waterway was dredged.
He had a love for the history and the land, and I think he just wanted to see that heritage preserved for the people of the county.
Today, Horry County Parks and Recreation operates the Vereen Memorial Historical Gardens, and it's open to the public.
When you enter the parking lot and the front gate at Vereen Memorial Gardens, the gate actually is right at the old original Kings Road, or original Broad Road, really. If you go to where the gate is and look to the left, that's the best preserved part of it. You can walk right down it on towards Mullet Creek, which is that creek that shows up on the old land grant. Horry County, the government, is trying to restore that road so it gives more of a feel of what it would have been like when President Washington came down it. And what they're doing is they're going to let undergrowth grow up on either side of the road and then put an old wooden rail fence on further out of the undergrowth to create that tunnel effect. So what they would have seen back then, is like a tunnel, and on either side it would have been the native trees and stuff growing up and arching over the road. And that's what we're trying to recreate. While we were up there doing some of that work, putting up the fence and stuff, actually somebody walking on the road, I think, found this. It was an old horseshoe, which we thought was very appropriate that, on the old Broad Road, they found an old horseshoe. We think dating it is from the 1800s. So it's very appropriate that we found that. I think it's on display now at the gardens.
The C.B. Berry Community Center at Vereen Gardens exhibits historical artifacts like the horseshoe in an effort to preserve the area's history. At the gardens, visitors can explore the land that the Vereen family preserved for generations. There are 3 miles of nature trails over land and water. As visitors walk through the woods, they'll notice guide signs pointing out plants and animals native to the area. Much of the property is shaded with canopies of trees, and there are several locations for sitting, picnicking, or even taking wedding photos. Visitors in search of some sun can venture out onto the boardwalks that connect hammocks or small islands in the marshland before reaching the waterway, lined with shell beaches. On the journey, fiddler crabs, birds, and seagulls will make a visit. Vereen Memorial Historical Gardens is one of the last undeveloped stretches along the coast of Horry County, in part of South Carolina's natural history.